Thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. I think we're going to get started for the sake of time. I know there's going to be some folks still trickling in. But first off, happy Thursday. You've made it through December of 2020. This is an achievement to be here at this point of this year. I wanted to welcome everyone. I'm one of the co-founders of the Trust and Safety Professional Association. We launched publicly in June of this year to really support the global community of professionals that develop acceptable content and behavior online. And we're so thrilled to welcome an extraordinary group of panelists today to really talk about the important topic of how trust and safety policies are developed. And with that, I wanted to turn the stage to Eric Davis, who is going to be our moderator for this event. He's been a veteran of trust and safety for over, I think, 15 years. Correct me if I'm wrong there, Eric. And then he's going to be introducing the other panelists and also moderating today's discussion. He's an advisor to TSPA, and we're so grateful for his contributions and his time today. With that, Eric, do you want to kick it off?
Sure. Thanks, Clara. We have here on the panel Sean Lee from Discord, Caitlin Sullivan from Facebook, Jan Eissfeldt from the Wikimedia Foundation. And we're going to spend most of the hour discussing a few topics that we hope will resonate with such a broad audience, backgrounds and skill sets. And we'll spend the last 15 minutes or so on audience Q&A. And for Q&A, as Clara mentioned, so this is a different format, as you may have noticed from your normal Zoom meetings. This is a webinar, and you can see on the bottom, there's a little Q&A, and you can upvote your votes. Feel free to submit the questions throughout, and we'll address as many as we can in the last 15 minutes. And if we don't get to your questions, we'll try to address some of them on the TSPA site, add them to the resource page. So why don't we start with the introductions for our policy mavens, and they'll tell us a little bit about themselves and their background, hopefully not using the third person. Let's start with Caitlin.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks so much, Clara, for putting this together as well. We're really excited to be participating in this. So as Eric said, my name is Caitlin Sullivan, and I'm here from Facebook. I have been at Facebook for nearly 8 years. It'll be 8 years in January, working all of that time in either public policy or content policy. Our content policy organization is currently about 150 people. When I started, it was about 5. So I think you'll hear us talk a lot today about the differences in how the companies approach these issues and how size plays into that. Before coming to Facebook, I had a background in public policy and also direct victims advocacy work for women's safety organizations.
Sean, why don't you go next?
Sure. Hi, Sean Lee. I've been with Discord for the past 3.5 years, and I run trust, safety, and policy. In contrast to Facebook, our policy team is 4 people last I checked, so a little bit different. And then before Discord, I spent a little bit of time at Reddit, and before that was doing legal operations and content safety at Dropbox.
Go ahead, Jan.
Good evening, I'm Jan. I run trust and safety at the Wikimedia Foundation, which means there's a small but highly competent professional team and a volunteer team, including with high impact on policy, the topic for today, of 5,000 or 125,000, depending how you count. We'll get to all of that later, I'm sure.
Great. Thanks, everybody. So start off talking about perception from the outside looking in, the reality once you started engaging in the fine art of crafting policy, some things that you were surprised to learn. And why don't we start off with Sean?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, right? Like before getting into it, I think historically, right, like policy has been very much kind of a, you know, kind of a black box of sorts where you're sort of, you look at these platforms and they come out with some policy and hopefully in the best of cases, right, with good communication, you're like, oh, I understand. But I think frequently it's this matter of, right, like, especially I think from the outside, you look at these policies come out and you're just like, how did we get here, right? Like, why did this happen? And it has been, it's really interesting being on the inside and starting to craft these policies. And I think the biggest thing is just like taking into account how many different viewpoints that need to be taken into account, how many stakeholders there are, right, and how you get to sort of the best outcome. I think from the outside, it's frequently one of those things where you're just like, oh, well, obviously this is the right answer, right? But I think once you dig into it, you're like, well, actually, there are 17 answers. Some of them are more right than others, but you're never actually fully sure, like if there even is a canonical right answer.
Well, and I think one of the interesting things, like I will admit, when I started at Facebook, I had no clue that these platforms had policies. I guess if you'd asked me to stop and think about it, I would have thought like, yes, I guess Twitter and Facebook and Google and Reddit must have some sort of rules. But the vast majority of people using our platforms, I mean, also if we're doing our jobs well, aren't seeing anything that might break the rules, that might violate. I think this has changed over the last 2 or 3 years as content moderation has become a bigger part of the public discussion. I mean, as a kind of nerd who wrote her grad school thesis on Section 230 a while ago, seeing that being tweeted on a regular basis is kind of funny because I don't know that half my professors knew what it was then. But it's really evolved into something that most people didn't know existed, and we all probably had to spend a lot more time explaining what our jobs were a decade ago, and that now end up on the front page of the New York Times. And I think that's also been a really interesting shift in the industry and something I wouldn't have expected from the outside.
Well, and just a reminder to folks, although actually 2 things. One, so we're about 7 minutes in, and that's we got Section 230 mentioned. So I was wondering how long it would take for it to come up with conversation. And then a reminder to the participants, there's a Q&A, a separate Q&A menu. So please use that to submit the questions. And there's also an option, you can even submit the questions anonymously because we don't have a real name policy. But please do use the Q&A instead of the chat for submitting questions. And Jan, please.
Yeah, I think specifically the change of perception by outside stakeholders, the public policymakers, etc., has made a huge shift in how we think about the policy process. When I walked into the ecosystem in early 2004, Facebook was a month old, literally on the day, and platforms like Reddit didn't exist. So it was, well, Google and us, basically. And it was an entirely internal conversation. Now, at the Wikimedia Foundation's case, of course, the internal conversation has always taken place in public. You can see how the sausage is made, so to speak, in our platform's case, going back all the 20 years it has been around. But the change in how other platforms have been thinking about that has been a very interesting evolution that also has flown back to how we think about that. We looked at some of Facebook's new innovations, for example, quite recently, and Twitter as well.
So let's start digging into the process of making policy and underscoring the panelists coming from different types of platforms with very distinct processes and I think cultures and styles. But Sean, why don't you start us off with how policy become? I was thinking of just the bill Schoolhouse Rock, but how policy gets made.
I was gonna say, like, this sounds like a good place to maybe have a new jingle for the 21st century. Yeah, so I mean, it comes from there's usually something that causes it, right? Like I think policy in this context is very similar. Really, it is very similar to laws in a standard government context, right? Like laws don't exist sort of for no reason. Like you don't sit around being like, well, why don't we create a law that like has no purpose? Like usually there's some some element, some, what's the word, catalyst, right, that sort of causes a conversation to be had. Oftentimes, this is someone doing something that is bad, and then you look at it and you're like, do we have a policy against that, right? Other times it is external forces, right? So if there is a conversation about, new technology that's coming out, that will be a catalyst for us to say, okay, is this something that we should consider, right? And so whatever that catalyst is, that ends up being discussed, right, through the policy team. And then you have this like multi-stakeholder process where you do some research, you collect as much data as you can, you consult relevant both internal and external stakeholders, right? We're talking about NGOs, we're talking about regulators, policymakers, our users, right? And then you craft something that, in the best of cases, you hope addresses the problem in sort of the best sort of way. And then I think one of the things that is often missed is that there's actually a long period of sort of like post-policy creation refinement, right? The first time I think that you look at something, you're like, okay, maybe we should handle it this way, right? Like, what's a good example? Like deepfakes, right, is something that has come up relatively recently. I think the entire industry sort of had to deal with it and figure it out. But like as that tech evolves and as the usage of that tech evolves, right, policy has to evolve with it too. And so it's not the sort of like, I guess actually in that sense, it's kind of not like laws per se, where often you pass it and then you just never revisit it, or you revisit it, I don't know, 20 years down the line, right? ECPA hasn't been touched in quite some time, right? It's much more of a sort of continuous process where you look at it every, potentially every month, and you're like, does this policy still fit what we wanted it to do?
Jan and Caitlin, please, and you don't need to wait for my cues. We want, we do want this to be a discussion, not a Q&A interrogation. So that should be all of our expectations. And also, please do speak to the stakeholders and the different teams involved with making process. I think a lot of people externally tend to think it's very narrow, or it's like a little star chamber, or just one or two people.
Yeah, our process looks pretty similar to what Sean outlined. And I love that idea of kind of catalyst, which can be so many different things, and then lots of iteration, testing, and feedback. I think a big catalyst probably for all of our companies, definitely for Facebook, are often our frontline reviewers. I know we've got a lot of direct content moderators here in TSPA. And for us, they're our biggest source of feedback. They're seeing the changing trends in abuse. They're seeing content that they don't know what to do with, or content that they think, hey, I think I ought to be doing this one thing, but the policy is telling me to do the other. And so that relationship is really symbiotic. I think a lot of people think of them sometimes as pretty separate functions. And then to Eric's point, I mean, we work with our kind of standard comms and legal and public policy folks, but we're also often working with folks in sales who directly are answering these questions on behalf of their clients, or partnerships because, Lady Gaga wants to wear something and Instagram's rules don't allow it, or security. I think something that all of our companies have dealt with are policies that have real impact for our employees on the ground in different places around the world that may have impacts for our physical security in a lot of ways. So we're talking at Facebook a size of, a bi-weekly meeting of 150 or so people that kind of dial in to have really robust discussions. Some of them get smaller. We do different working groups. We're trying to get the global representation as well. Sean and I are based in the US, Jan's based in Europe, but we all have platforms with users based everywhere around the world.
I think the last point really starts resonating if you put policy process into context, right? So at the Wikimedia's ecosystem, of course, we don't have one centralized policy making process. It's more like the foundation sets a frame, like a constitutional outline. And within that frame, communities can paint their own pictures in 383 languages according to their own context. So policy is being made on our platform every day, specifically content moderation policy, and they do that largely autonomously within that framework. And it comes with some interesting, quite constitutional questions that are distinctly different from what other platforms have, which is, well, if self-organization hits its own problems, in that autonomous community-driven model where you elect your own representatives and all of that stuff. We have to create an additional layer of policy on top of what other platforms have that just settles political disputes or identity disputes within the community that runs the platform. Big, quite high-profile example of that I also see James Alexander being in the crowd a couple of years back helped resolve was what happens if volunteers actually work with people who have a monetary incentive to contribute to Wikipedia. And what does it do to the value of volunteer work, and how does it relate to other platforms? Because a lot of those contracts actually run through Upwork, because the foundation has nothing to do with that. And that then becomes a very interesting community-centered policy making, as opposed to the standard policies that we run through our own team as a platform provider.
Eric, you're definitely muted.
My bad. Yep. Sorry. Over the years, I think we've seen the transparency of policy development and sort of the accessibility of policy people increase. And Sean, you in particular, or Discord rather, back in, I don't want to say back in the day, but you know, there was a time when policy, you tell somebody you're a policy person and they really have no idea, even if they're in tech. And in terms of describing what the considerations were, and everybody is heavily influenced by lawyers, rightly so. I don't think influence is even a light way of putting it. But Sean, you go on Reddit often to answer questions about the policies and to dig in. Yeah, I find that really remarkable. I can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit of a minefield at times, right? But I think that like ultimately, right, like the value, you know, I think part of it is that the policy, like whatever the policy is, and having good policy is important, right, obviously. But I think like the communication around that policy is becoming just as important, right? Like you need for your users, right, for everyone that is engaging with this policy to trust, right, that it comes from not just, I think, a good place with good intentions, but also that you've thought through a lot of these things. And so, right, like I think this is the sort of inherent value of actually transparency as a whole, right, is that you get to a point where you're not just like, here's the policy, like, you know, like it or leave it, right? It's like, here's the policy, here's what we've taken into account, here are like the other like potential sort of possibilities, right? Like in some sense, the more transparent, right, that you can be about how a policy came to be, right, the more trust that you engender in your community. Because frequently, right, like they will have questions. They're like, hey, but why, you know, why is this word banned and not this word? Or like, you know, why are you taking actions against this group but not this group? Like, isn't that biased, right? And the more you can be like, no, here's the process, right? That there was a process, a due process, if you will, for the lawyers out there, right? And that this is like how it came to be and why it came to be. I think the more faith, right, that you have that the system is sound. And I think like that's the fundamental cornerstone of a good system, is that the people that are subject to these policies need to understand that it's not arbitrary, right? It's not like three people getting into a room and being like, well, I don't like this group of people, like, why don't we just like shut them down, right? Instead, it's like this pretty, frankly, arduous process of understanding like, you know, how to craft, in some sense, I think the short form is like how to craft the society that you want on whatever platform it is.
And there are lots of different types of interactions with stakeholders as you develop the policies. And I'd love to hear some of your more interesting topics or conversations about, let's say, very distinct policies, conversations you never thought you'd be having in any type of work environment.
I think I was sharing with someone the other day that the best professional compliment I have ever gotten was someone who told me after a briefing with our VP of Global Policy that I'm very good at talking about genitalia with a straight face. And if my mother knew that that's what I spent a fair amount of my workday doing, I don't know how proud of me she'd be. But we have to talk about all of the issues that come up and become experts in some really different areas as we're learning and developing policies in them. And we all have policies that run the gamut, probably from nudity to war crimes to regulated goods. I now know all of the different parts of a firearm and which parts are harmful and should be banned from sales and which parts are accessories and scopes and should be fine. And you know, whether I thought I'd be asking my friend to dismantle a rifle in front of me to help me learn parts as part of my job when I signed up, probably not. But I think that's one of the really fun things about this work is there's such a wide spectrum of issues you get to touch, and different companies have it set up differently, and some folks end up specializing, but I think we all end up surprised every week by the emails that come across our inbox and what we get to learn about.
Yeah, it's just, you know, it really runs the gamut, right? Like, you know, we're dealing with incredibly large platforms, right? Like hundreds of millions of users. And the fact is that when you have interpersonal conflicts between hundreds of millions of users, you will see every, right? If there is a crime, we have probably seen it on our platforms, or someone has talked about it on our platforms, right? And we have to deal with it. And I think that includes, right, like things that are not crimes, but are certainly, you know, weird, not dinner table conversations. I think that, you know, a fun thing that came up recently is that we just developed our first employee handbook for everyone. And as part of that, there's like a general, you know, as with every employee handbook, there's like, you know, don't use your work computer for like, you know, not safe for work or like adult content or blah, blah, blah. There's a parenthetical in our employee handbook that says, unless it's part of your job, comma, for example, trust and safety, right? And it's like, that's the sort of stuff that we see that is just like not very common, and is really, you know, when people ask like, what is the weirdest thing that we've seen on the job? Like, there are a lot of crazy answers to that question. And I think the answer changes on a weekly basis.
Yeah, Wikimedia's context is certainly politics, right? Geopolitics in particular. Countries fight pretty hard about what they think knowledge should be and who gets to see it. So there's a lot of that. But it also has a very interesting dimension to it, which is quite educational. I probably learned no more ever about colonial history of Indonesia, for example, than a couple of months back when the post-colonial establishment was fighting with Islamist parts of their judiciary about a quite obscure law from Dutch colonial times. And then that swapped over onto Wikipedia, and from Wikipedia very quickly onto Facebook, and from Facebook over to Discord in some like 8 hours. So there's a lot of that flowing back and forth that comes with some interesting dimensions.
Speaking to transparency, Sean's comments before, engagement or even visibility to the outside community, can you speak to concerns or just practices? Because I mean, we know there have been situations like at Twitter where folks have believed they've identified that one person who changed everything, and you know, they've been doxxed, or you know, there was the YouTube shooting incident. But speak to your feelings about how you approach it and how you feel you're protecting yourself and, you know, also your team. And,
yeah,
Caitlin, what? Yeah.
Happy to start with this one. I think we think about transparency in kind of two ways. One is about our policies themselves and the process behind them, as Sean was talking about, really integral to be as transparent as possible on those so that people understand what's expected of them and understand the process that went into them. So over the last really 3 years at Facebook, we've taken strides for some pretty radical transparency, or what was considered radical 5 years ago. We updated our community standards to include nearly all of our enforcement reviewer guidelines. We publish minutes and slides from the monthly meetings we have where we change these policies. We have a change log. We have the oversight board. And that comes with some risks of its own. I think someone in one of the questions kind of talked about, are there risks of adversarial responses to those? Yes, I think we tend to err on the side of people learning our policies and complying, and the benefits of transparency outweigh the risks of adversarial responses, although that trade-off varies by kind of abuse area. And then you have transparency about the people who do the work day in and day out. And I think that is where we are a lot more protective of our people, especially policy team members, reviewers who sit all over the world, many of whom come from and still either live in or have family who live in conflict zones or countries where we are not making the government particularly happy, and the safety of our people always comes first. So transparency on that personal level is always a choice given to someone, and we tend to err very much on safety on that front as well. So I think there's the kind of two tracks of transparency there.
Yeah, as far as policies are concerned, right, that has been in Wikimedia's case out there forever, including the actual process of creating it. But I think the YouTube incident that has been referenced earlier has been a watershed moment, certainly for our side of the industry, about how we think about transparency of people. And traditionally, for the better part of the last 2 decades, all of Wikimedia's people who worked related to trust and safety, but also other sensitive higher risk roles in the foundation, or were out there just like everyone else who's on the payroll with their picture and with their legal name on wikimediafoundation.org. And after that incident, as well as the nation state issue that shall be unnamed, we switched that. So now it's just me who was on there, and everyone who reports to me through various management verticals got off that page. So as the freedom of the internet at large has been declining, and that has impacted all our platforms, we certainly changed policy in that regard. It's much less comfortable to join the field these days than it was, back then.
Yeah, and I think just to touch on it, right, like it is this like, I think uncomfortable tension, because in a lot of ways, I think we do want to be as transparent as possible, right? And that includes the people that are developing the policies. Like, I think we are, at least like part of the reason actually that I go on Reddit sometimes, right, is like, I want to have a good faith discussion about why we did a particular thing and like what we thought about. But I think the danger, right, that we have seen in the last couple of years is that obviously, right, like, when you, again, run a platform of a couple 100 million people, not everyone is reasonable. And I think that extends, and we've certainly seen this is not new to us, right? Like the government and the judicial space has dealt with this for a long time in sort of like kind of different contexts, right? But certainly there is some risk there. And I mean, as a result, right, like we similarly, I think, as with everyone else, right, like there's a measure of like, you have to protect your people, right? Like no one doing their job should be subject to, to swatting, right? Or to the potential of real world harm. It's, I will say it was kind of uncomfortable that if you search my name and Doxbin right now, I think the top hit on Google because someone really didn't like an enforcement action that we took and they decided to take it out on me. And so now, my cell phone is, I guess, just like floating out there. I got an uncomfortable text message at 2:30 a.m. that was like, hey, I have your cell phone number. But I mean, I think that's, it's something that like every company, right, like should take steps to obviously, I think, like protect their employees. And I think that, I wish that this were not the case, but this is just how the world is these days.
Yeah. And when you're developing the policies, I mean, there are the things that you want to do and the world the way you would want it, and then the realism of, okay, how would you actually enforce it? How would you develop the policy in such a way that moderators who are quite a few potentially degrees of separation can pick up the nuances when they are evaluating? So could you speak to developing policies in such a way that you're ensuring that they can be applied and enforced consistent with the intent?
Yeah.
Spontaneously.
I think this is key for all of us. A policy is only as good as the piece of paper it's written on, unless it can actually be put into practice. And I think this is one of the hardest and steepest learning curves for most people entering kind of the content policy, trust and safety world. It's not enough to write a relatively high level policy. Here's what we don't want to allow. I mean, even something like nudity, which I think lots of folks may think is obvious, it when you see it. Why do you need to define what a nude person is? Our policies on nudity are probably at least 5 pages long in kind of very detail on what exactly you need to see and how much of it in order to remove the content. And I think that's how we really approach the issue of enforceability, is trying to provide as much nuance and detail and account for as many situations as possible. This is not kind of a judgment call. Does someone think this is inappropriate nudity? It is, does it meet A, B, C, D requirement on the checklist? And that comes with a lot of back and forth, and that comes with what I was kind of referring to is the symbiotic relationship that comes with reviewers coming back and telling us, actually, no, I don't know what to do with this whole swath of content. You need to write a better policy. Your policy doesn't account for this. Your policy wants me to look at something that I can't see in the tooling that I have available to me. And so our team spends a lot of time directly with our frontline content moderators, visiting sites where folks are working, giving first and early drafts to reviewers, to folks on our training and quality teams to get feedback on. I think one thing that's shifting is the shift to from writing an enforceable policy for people to enforce to writing an enforceable policy for machine learning to learn on and enforce too. And that's something we're in the midst of now, and talking about how to make our policies more resilient for automation as well. But under whatever enforcement regime you have, I think there's always that really key feedback loop with the people on the front lines.
Yeah. Caitlin, how often do you find that, okay, this policy is warranted, people feel pretty passionate about it, but we don't have the infrastructure or the tools ready yet? So, you know, this could be a few quarters until we could actually build something that is feasible.
Yeah, that happens a fair amount, not in the majority of cases, because our infrastructure is fairly mature at this point. And in those cases, what we'll usually do is still kind of write the policy and have it on the books, but only apply it in the situations where we do have that context available. Because we still want to, when we can, get to the right outcome for people as we're working to figure out how to scale it.
Yeah, the regime issue, I think, is really important. And it brings two factors in that, especially if you're a younger policy professional or generally in the field of trust and safety, you don't necessarily think about, which is, how does the business model work, right? It's a shaping factor of a policy-making process, whether you have your moderators in-house or whether you have them outsourced in a different company where your ability to ensure throughput looks very different, or whether you negotiate with community members like we do, because then it only becomes policy if you have the buy-in for how do I implement it in my local context to begin with. And the other factor that really shapes this, and Caitlin touched upon that thankfully quite correctly, is, well, how does the platform architecture look like? What can it enable? And that has an impact both on how do you implement this stuff, but also what are the relevant questions? Because depending on the purpose and the architecture of the platform, the questions you have to resolve as a professional also differ significantly.
Yeah, absolutely. Just on that, right? Like, and I think as a sort of concrete example, if you're looking at a sort of like by default public platform, right? Like a TikTok, for example, maybe a YouTube, right? A Twitter, right? Where everything can go to everyone. The sort of like the abuse space, if you will, right? It's very different than if you're running, for example, a messaging platform, right? Where like you actually could not reach all, 100+ million people if you tried, or if you're running, for example, like in Encyclopedia, right? That anyone can edit, where there really are like very few private messages, right? Like all of, the products and the companies and the platforms, right, all have very different goals. And it's like policy, right? Like it's not this sort of like one size fits all policy where it's like, oh, like, no nudity, right? Like it purely depends on what your company and what your platform wants to accomplish, I think. And that really should be the fundamental driver of policy. Just the other thing to sort of touch on, I think, on like enforcement, because I think, right, like everything Caitlin said, 100%, right? Like if you cannot enforce your policy, you don't have good policy. And actually, I will go one step further and say, if you cannot like meaningfully enforce your policy, what you actually have is like aggressively bad policy, because you are saying one thing and then you're actually not enforcing that leads to like a decrease in user trust, right? When the user like looks at your policy page, your guidelines or whatever, and says, hey, it says you prohibit this. And then every time they report that, you actually don't prohibit that, right? Like people will stop reporting. And I'm not going to name any names, right, or call anyone out, but it's like, right, like there's a fundamental, I think a way of looking at it is like, if you call 911 and like, you're like, hey, this person is robbing me. And they're like, yeah, that's definitely against the law. And then no one shows up. You stop calling 911 pretty quickly. And you also like just don't have a trust in your government anymore, right? And so I think it's really, really important to have that just incredibly tight feedback loop between your policy creators, right, and your enforcement team. For us actually here at Discord, we sort of have the benefit of like, so I started the team 3.5 years ago. Every person who's on our policy team came up through trust and safety, right? And actually every person, I think actually without exception, still does tickets. And like for us, the goal is to not necessarily, right, to break it out actually as little as possible, such that the people that are writing the policies are really also the people that are like looking at these cases, right? And they see the firsthand, they have that firsthand experience of how those policies are actually, existing out in the wild, what the edge cases are, what the corner cases are, and they can sort of respond to that very quickly. It's not this sort of like situation where you necessarily need to say, oh, hey, I think that there's a problem with the policy. Let me bounce this over to the policy team. It's like, hey, there's a problem with this policy. How can we make it better, immediately?
Sean's answer is also very applicable to people who wonder why policy is associated with trust and safety. Also underscores just how much empathy is, I think, part of the process. In terms of drivers of policy, Sean, can you speak to how much, and this is also sort of the myths and facts bucket, Sean, will you speak to the extent to which revenue is a consideration? Same question for Caitlin. Jan, you're excused from this question.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the fundamental way that certainly, at least that we think about it, right, is like, your policy team are effectively your lawmakers, right? Policy and trust and safety together make up the government of your platform, right? You are literally writing what is allowed and what is not allowed. And like, in order for there to be that trust that I've talked about, right, like you cannot, like you don't think about revenue. Like you just don't think about it at all, right? Like it sort of comes down to, I think, something that everyone should agree with, right? Like no one is above the law, right? And it doesn't matter whether you are the biggest moneymaker for the platform or whether you are a completely new user that, or maybe a person who will never pay anything for the platform, right? Like once you start making exceptions based on, based on revenue considerations, you don't have a system of government anymore, right? You don't have a system of laws. What you have is a system of like, how can I make more money? And it's like, again, I think at the end of the day, that leads to like just a breakdown and a decrease of trust in the platform. So, I mean, I think candidly, the answer for any really like good functioning like trust and safety and policy team is that revenue is never a consideration.
I would echo that at Facebook. It has never come into direct consideration with any of our policy making. I also think at a macro sense, sometimes people think of our incentives as being at cross purposes, that there are, there's this meme out there that Facebook, Twitter, whatever platform is incentivized to have a whole bunch of thrashy disinformation, flame wars, whatnot, in order to drive more clicks, more engagement, more money. And that is at odds with what our content policy and trust and safety orgs do at these companies. I think across the board, and definitely in our experience, that's not true. Revenue goals and trust and safety goals are generally pointed in the same direction. Advertisers want to advertise on safe platforms. People engage more when they feel safe and welcome in a space. Those aren't the reasons why we build, for empowered users and safe users, but they are not at odds with each other in the way that I think sometimes it plays out in the media narrative too.
That was a pretty remarkable moment. My early days at Google, we were presenting to Larry and Sergey, and okay, this is the revenue impact of this policy. And Larry was like, okay, if they're slimy, we don't want their money. And it's like, wow, it is great to see organizations with that kind of culture and mentality. So we have a few minutes left until we start going through audience Q&A. So maybe, Caitlin, could you walk us, this is probably unfair, but quickly through a time that you had to deal with a really controversial policy considerations you made, how it worked out?
Yeah, there are quite a few to pick from.
Hanging fruit.
So one of the things, recent kind of policy change that we made was an update to our policies around Holocaust denial. Back in October, we made a move to ban Holocaust denial from our platform. And this has been, it was in some ways a reversal of a decade plus kind of stance that Facebook had really taken about misinformation generally and Holocaust denial specifically, that the best way to combat it was with more speech. I think given what we were seeing on the platform with really close links to hate speech, where we were removing the bulk of it already, and close links to violence and upticks in anti-Semitic violence on the around the world, we decided to change our stance. And I think one of the things that is also a bit of a myth around content policy and policy development is that anything is ever done. I don't think that changing policies and changing policies over time is a bad thing. I think, as Sean was saying, it's a really expected thing and something that's actually quite different than maybe how government and lawmaking works. We're always looking for a policy line that is better than the status quo, not one that is perfect, and iterating throughout. And our considerations are kind of how the content is playing out on our platform, first and foremost. There's a whole lot of things that Facebook could take a stand on just for the sake of taking a stand on it. But if it's not actually affecting content on our platform, it's probably not something we're going to develop a policy on. And then we want to really work with all of our internal teams that might be affected, and then external experts. We are not experts in everything that we work on. I think we talked about the range of issues, and no one could be an expert on all of those. As Jan said, you can get up to speed pretty quickly on some nuanced geopolitical issue, but we're never going to be the experts. So we want to reach out and talk to those folks, and that's going to look different for every expert or every issue, and then kind of weigh the various inputs and then what we can do to actually make a change, what's enforceable at the end of the day.
Great. So we have our exit question for this portion. Jan, then Sean, then Caitlin. Why do you, the roller coaster ride, the external pressures, like what sort of powers you through this? Why do you keep doing it? What makes you passionate about this area?
Oh, curiosity, more than anything else, right? Specifically in a role like mine, where you don't just have the policy component and its complexity, but also have the operations and the content moderation and the technology all flowing over your desk as waves on a daily basis. The sheer intellectual flexibility that comes with it is the driving force that makes me smilingly jump out of bed in the morning. Every morning, including on weekends, I'm afraid.
Yeah, the life of being on call.
At all hours.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, honestly, it's the privilege, right? And I think in many cases, the honor of being able to try and do right by all of these people, right? Like, I think that, well, so, right, like in in the early 90s, right, like John Perry Barlow of the EFF wrote like a beautiful manifesto that I think has not necessarily come out and actually looked very realistic, but he was like, look, cyberspace, right, the laws of man have like no meaning here, we are all one, et cetera, right? It was a very, it was a different time of the internet. But I think that, and certainly in the past 4 years, I think we're like, well, maybe none of those things are true. But I think that there is, right, like this promise, right, this potential of the internet being that place, right, where people can come together, right, can meet each other, right, can find each other in ways that they were never able to before. And I think it is a huge responsibility to make sure that, right, like that good outcomes happen, right, that it is not, the internet is the foe or bad or whatever, right, that it's not bad for humanity. And I think that's the thing, that, right, like that I get up every morning and I'm like, right, like, the decisions that we make, right, like impact these hundreds of millions, these billions of people. And if we do it right, then we will ensure more connection, more conversation, and more, frankly, like happiness, right? More openness, more a whole bunch of good things. And in order to do that, right, we have to minimize all of the bad things. And we need to make sure that we have good policies, right, that they are well enforced, right, that at the end of the day, people look at this and I guess, like, to put it plainly, right, like, in short, like, if we do our jobs right, we can be that, like, aspirational, better government that I think people once dreamed of. I don't know that it's realistic, right? But I think it's a good goal to strive for.
I think what Jan and Sean are both said are really motivating. For me, coming from being a victims advocate before coming to Facebook and tech, never really thinking that I'd end up working in this sort of role in Facebook and tech. I really see it though as a big continuation. Every good policy we write, every successful enforcement measure is really meaningful for someone's individual life. And I'm able to do that now at a scale for billions of people instead of advocating for a caseload of 30 people. But I think it's the same work, advocating for those at the margins to be centered, advocating for vulnerable groups, being the voice in the room for whoever is not getting their voice heard, and making sure that they're included in this future internet that we are all making.
These are wonderful answers. I'm inspired. So getting to audience questions, and we're going to mix around a little high level into more detail, but a question about how other organizations, people outside sort of the normal policy chain of discussion, stakeholders can contribute. And how do you handle feedback or queries from people throughout your company, like who want to help contribute in some way to the policy making?
Yeah, I can probably start with this one.
Please.
In the way this works at Wikimedia is it depends on the strength of the argument, right? So everyone can put their arguments forward, and it doesn't really matter where they come from, be that in the community, staff, academia, other platform professionals for that matter, or otherwise. But the argument has to stack up, and it has to be tested in discursive, collaborative working environment, both within my trust and safety verticals, notably, of course, the policy vertical, but also more often than not with community. So scrutiny has to be applied, and one has to be quite clear with those stakeholders, executives and other departments, for example, that their arguments will be treated just like any other.
Caitlin, what data point, getting more granular, what data points do you use when, or analyze when you're framing policies?
It depends on what the policy issue is. Sometimes we're changing a policy and it's really about values and principles far more than any data points. And the data points are good to know what the impact is, but won't drive the decision. Sometimes the policy has a more specific goal, maybe to decrease this sort of type of speech, to maximize kind of voice in this area. And then we are going to be looking and working really closely with our data scientists to see what effect does it actually have when we do those things.
Sean, how about you?
Sorry, one more time. I was answering a question in text.
We're all very engaged, and that's a good thing. So just in terms of the data points, framing your policy considerations, the functional process of it.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, like, I think in some sense, like, you can't have enough data, right? Like in order to make really good policy, really what you want to do is, like, you want to have a complete understanding of, hopefully actually of all possible outcomes, right? And so, you know, that's going to be a mixture of, like, the data that you have on the platform itself of, like, oh, how often are users engaging or interacting with, you know, whatever piece of content or whatever it is that you are, you know, potentially banning, but also, right, like, you have a lot of conversations, right, with the subject matter experts, both internally, I think, and also externally, right, with NGOs, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, when we, for example, when we're talking about hate speech and hate speech policies, right, like, it is useful for us to also communicate with, you know, the ADL or the SPLC or, you know, some of those organizations in Western Europe, post, like, extremism organizations, right? Because I think the fundamental truth, right, is, like, we obviously don't know everything, right? And I think as much as we see it on our platform, it's also important to take that context into, like, the wider sphere of things. So, yeah, like, I think when we are drafting policies, the real goal is to talk to, like, frankly, as many, like, people as possible, right? Academics also, of course, absolutely, in, like, getting that research and just, like, truly understanding, like, the true scope of the problem.
Caitlin, how do you help ground yourself when there's so much external sentiment around particular policies, or it could be you or somebody, a public policy person just met with a congressman, and they're hyper-focused on this. This is what they think. How do you kind of keep your perspective be consistent with sort of the company values?
Yeah. First, I think when reading anything about the company, especially people who are really passionate and have strong views about what we've done or haven't done, one thing I always try to keep in mind is they care because it matters. It is a privilege to work on these issues that impact so many people to the degree that we have newsrooms covering us and legislators interested in us and our work. And then I think we take this specific input, it is all feedback is fair feedback, and we try to take it as fair on face value and see what's there, what we can learn from it, but also to Sean's point, kind of put it in perspective with all of the other feedback that we've gotten, which is often coming from all sorts of directions.
There have been some questions about design. Is there a class for developing certain policies or handling content moderation? I'm going to put in a plug for the TSPA resource page. And also, there's a lot underway with the TSPA's plans. I think all of us are involved with crafting a food camp and a whole bunch of neat things. So definitely on everyone's mind, and hopefully underway, or is underway and hopefully soon.
And if everyone is signed up for our newsletter, we'll have all of that information that will be shared out as soon as those resources are available. So thank you so much for that plug, Eric.
Sure. So I'm optional 30 seconds each, thoughts on Section 230, starting with Jan, even though it's less applicable there.
Or will be the biggest show for the next 18 months, right? Or the domestic half of the show. Europe and probably India will be just as busy. And all of us will be spending loads of time trying to figure that stuff out.
Most of the conversation of late in the US doesn't seem to actually be about Section 230, even when it mentions Section 230. And I think regardless of where anyone or any company stands on the future of it, I think we all want an actual substantive discussion about how it works, how it played out, and how, if at all, it needs to be adjusted.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to echo that, right? Like I am all for good substantive discussion. I think, professors like Danielle Citron and Marianne Franks, right, like are both like great, right? Like, there are a lot of experts out there. Not all of them agree that, on Section 230, but like they're at least like engaging in good faith, right? Like with substantive discussions. And I candidly am not clear that that is what is happening on the Hill right now. And that makes me a little bit disappointed. And that's all I'm going to say about that.
I realized after I asked the question to Jan, and this speaks to also audience comments, Sean and Caitlin, how do you keep from being a little too US-centric in your mindset? I think it's also another question about sort of regrounding and resetting your perspective.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that's absolutely like a great comment, right? I think that the maybe the tech titans of old, like 10 years ago, were a little bit more US-centric in their attitudes, especially I think in their first incursions into Europe, right? And I think the answer is that, right, like
incursions.
Advancements, whatever. But yeah, I think that the fundamental truth, right, is that it should not be a situation of like, oh yes, we're just like exporting American values, right? Like we have, over 100 million users. Only I think not even I think the plurality of them, if I remember correctly, are American at this point in time. And so, I mean, for us, part of it is making sure that we, especially as we continue to grow, right? Like making sure that we have that local voice and that understanding of local culture more so than anything else. Obviously, working with NGOs in the area is really important, but I think it truly goes beyond, right? Like we don't want a world where the people making the decisions are just sitting in San Francisco, right? We don't want a world where the people making the decisions are just sitting in the United States. We want a world where the people that are making the decisions, at the very least, right, have the complete context of the decision that they're making from like a person who hopefully actually in the best of cases like grew up in that area, right? Like I think in the best of cases, like your policy team making these policies should look frankly kind of like the UN, right? Like much more so than it should look like, I don't know, NATO or something like that, right? Which I suspect is what most of our policy teams currently look at.
I am a poor representative of our policy team. We have folks on content policy sitting in 9 offices from 21 different home countries who speak 30 languages. I think I am one of the few who shamefully only speaks English with any degree of fluency and even stutter there sometimes. So to Sean's point, I think that's been the biggest change in how we've tried to diversify our perspectives. You have to hire people, you have to put offices in different places, you have to have the folks deeply embedded in the work representing more points of view.
So and Jan, you can start with this, but in explaining a policy internally, concrete examples can be hugely helpful. Externally, it's not okay to use those examples for privacy or even legal reasons. How big a problem is this for communicating policies to the user base and the general public? Again, taking in mind, the different platforms, Wikimedia versus the others.
Yeah, I think this is where platform purpose and architecture really plays a big role, right? Because most of the policies that we develop for our platform, right, which is general educational purpose for charitable distribution only, you can always point to a specific example because they are out there and they're publicly available, and they usually have no privacy aspect to them. They're edge cases naturally. But it looks as a challenge from policy development point of view for us, for example, very different than for Discord or Facebook, who have a big chunk of this stuff they have to look at quite carefully.
This is also me trying to give Jan more questions. So 30-second responses from Sean and Caitlin.
Right. Yeah, I think we have some privacy concerns when it comes to looking at specifics that public companies don't, but I do think testing your policies on specific examples is always the best way to really sharpen them, to formulate them, to know how to explain them.
Yeah, I think, in a perfect world, well, in a better world, right? Like I think that, like I said, I sort of beat this drum all the time, right? But I think transparency is useful, right? Like, in the American judicial system, like when someone is convicted of a crime, you can, in most cases, not all cases, right? But in most cases, you can follow the entire like loop of it, right? Like from the arrest to the judicial proceedings to like the court proceedings, all of that stuff. And I think like that like level of transparency, again, like adds a sense of trust in the system. Even if you don't agree with it, you're like, well, due process was followed here, right? Like this was the process. And I think that, for policy and for trust and safety and for content moderation, the more that we can get closer to that, again, there are privacy concerns, absolutely. There are safety concerns, right? Absolutely. But I think the closer that we can get to that, ultimately, the better we will be.
Excellent. Okay, we are at time. Thank you so much to our fantastic panelists and to the Trust and Safety Professional Association for putting this together. As Clara said, we're working to respond to your questions that will be posted, and please do go to TSPA info for more information. Again, thank you so much to everybody.
And for those that are TSPA members, we will be having an event next week on trends in global content regulation and impact on platforms. So I know there's a lot of questions about global legislation. We'll cover that then. Definitely consider yourselves for membership for some events that we keep smaller. And then obviously we'll have a lot more bigger events like these in the future as well. So thank you so much for joining today. And we will also be addressing some of your questions in a follow-up. We've been capturing questions we don't get to. And so our panelists have been so generous with their times, and they'll also try to answer most of your other questions in a follow-up email. So thank you so much, everyone. Great. Well, Take care and have a great holiday season ahead.
Thank you, Clara.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Clara.
Have a great night, people.